I can't count.
I'm going to do something a little different tonight. We're going to be talking about Christian families and civil government. I'm going to have to be using my notes considerably because this comes out of a section of a book that I've just written entitled, Let's Talk About Family. Its challenges in a new age culture. The first several sections of that book deals with national issues and governmental issues that affect traditional family life. And then the rest of the book deals with God's design for family. And I hope that to be published relatively soon. So I'm going to have to be using my notes considerably since what I'm going to share with you comes from that particular section. Christian families and civil government. I want to begin by talking about the primary duty of civil government.
Chapter 10.
We're in Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12, look at verse 18. If it is possible, as much as depends upon you, live peaceably with all men. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath. Whose wrath? That would be God's wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine. I will repay, says the Lord. And so we are not to repay evil with evil. We are not to seek private retribution. We must leave that up to God. That does not mean that we are not free to protect our families. Not at all. It simply means that if we have a choice, then we allow God to take care of that. And he does that basically through civil government. And that's why Paul goes right into chapter 13 and verse 1 and states what he does when he says, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except that which comes from God. And the authorities that exist are appointed by God. He says that rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Well, if you do want to be unafraid, he says, do what is good, and you will have praise for the same. Here's the reason, verse 4. He is God's servant, God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's servant, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. And that ties right back in with verse 19 of chapter 12 that we read a moment ago. God says, wrath belongs to me. And he'll exercise that wrath through bringing judgment on a people, judgment on a nation, future judgment. Nobody gets away with anything. And he uses civil government to express his wrath toward those who do not keep law and who do evil. For this cause you also pay taxes. That's in verse 6. We pay taxes to support those who execute wrath on those who practice evil. Now the Roman government didn't always do that. Our government doesn't always do that. They sometimes abuse the power, don't they? And therefore they need to be held accountable for doing so. Paul doesn't deal with holding government accountable in this verse of Scripture. But he does in other sections of Scripture. And you have to ask the question, what happens when the rulers are the ones who are breaking the rule of law? and bringing harm to innocent people, people who are not guilty. What then? What if there is a distinct failure on the part of civil government to adequately punish the evildoer? What if they punish the wrong people more than they should? Well, we have an example of this very thing happening in Acts chapter 16. So I want you to turn there, if you will, to Acts chapter 16. And we're going to look at verses 16 through 39. Now, I'm not going to read all those verses. We will start at verse 35 and do the reading, but let me just tell you what is going on here. This is on Paul's second missionary journey. He is with Paul, and Paul is with Silas and Timothy and Luke. And so Paul and Silas, as they are in the city of Philippi on this journey, there was a riot that was caused. Paul and Silas was arrested, and I'm not going to go into the detail of what caused the riot. But what happened is that they were arrested. They were beaten with many rods, with many times, with rods. They were put in stocks and thrown into prison. They were beaten severely because it states that they were beaten with rods many times. That's the way the Romans would punish. The Jews would use a whip. The Romans would use something like a broomstick. And they'd beat people. And that's what happened to Paul and Silas. They were severely beaten, put in stocks, and put in prison. We all know the story of the Philippian jailer, don't we? And we know what happened that night. And why Paul was able to, if he wanted to, walk right out the doors of the jail because it was an earthquake. We know what happened. But the next morning, the magistrates, verse 35, are you with me in Acts 16? Acts 16:35, when it was day, the magistrates sent the officers saying, let these men go. Of course, those are Roman magistrates. In a Gentile city, Philippi was a Roman colony. They are in a Gentile city, they are Jews, there's a riot, they've been beaten and thrown in prison. And now let them go. Verse 36, so the keeper of the prison reported these words to Paul, saying, the magistrates have sent to let you go. Now therefore depart and go in peace. Notice what Paul said. Notice his response in verse 37. They have beaten us openly, uncondemned Romans. Paul and Silas hold a Roman citizenship. They are Romans. Here you have Romans beating fellow Romans. That was against Roman law. You could not, without a process of going to a trial, having due process, having an investigation, and then if you're found guilty, you could be punished. But if you didn't follow the due process, these people could get in serious trouble and lose their jobs. Paul says, you've thrown us in prison, and now do they put us out secretly? No, indeed. Let them come themselves and let us out. And the officers told these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid. I missed the verse where they were told that they're Romans. It's verse 37. Paul said to them, they have beaten us openly, uncondemned. Okay, I read that. I ate too much at Freddy's before coming. Uncondemned Romans. So the officers told these words to the magistrates, verse 38, and they were afraid. Well, why were they afraid? Because they'd broken their own law when they heard that they were Romans. And when they came and pleaded with them, when the Romans came and pleaded with Paul and Silas obviously apologized because they don't want to get in trouble, and brought them out and asked them to depart. And they did. Well, they actually went to Lydia's house before they did. Paul didn't speak dishonorably to these men. He wasn't rude. He was kind. He spoke to them with dignity and respect. But what did he do? He held them accountable for their breaking of law, breaking their own law. Rulers are not always worthy of their office, are they? They're not. And their unworthiness often serves as a reason for removing them from that office. Brethren, the book of Acts is a highly political book. And we need not be afraid of that. And then later, Paul is arrested in Jerusalem. That's the end of his third missionary journey. Comes back to Jerusalem. And turn please to Acts 22. Acts chapter 22. And we're going to look at verse 22 through 29. And again, I'm not going to read all the verses. I'll just relate a few things that occurred on this occasion. But in this text, we have a record of Paul being accused of bringing a Gentile into the temple. And this caused the Jews to rush around him and were threatening to kill him. And when they were around him and started beating him, Roman soldiers descended on the crowd. That's what Roman soldiers did. You remember watching The Chosen, that the Roman soldiers were always around to hold down chaos and anarchy and riots. So these Roman soldiers descended on the Jewish crowd, and when the Jews saw the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. They were going to beat him to death. They were going to beat him to death with their fists and clubs. The Roman soldiers are going to take Paul into the Roman barracks to protect him. And Paul requested to speak to the crowd of Jews in order to make a defense. He was granted that request. Paul told the crowd of how he had persecuted the church. He told them about his conversion and how that God had sent him to preach to the Gentiles. And when he said the word Gentile, what did they do? They went into a frenzy when he said that God sent me to the Gentiles. Notice verse 22. Verse 22 of Acts 22. And they listened to Paul until this word about the Gentiles. And then they raised their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth. He's not fit to live. The Roman commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks and said that he should be examined under scourging so that he might know why they shouted against him. So they were going to scourge Paul. The Romans were. He's already been beaten up by his own Jewish brethren, and now he's going to be scourged by these Roman soldiers. Verse 25, and as they bound him with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who stood by, is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned? Again, no trial, no due process, no investigation. And he's about to be beaten by a fellow Roman. When the fellow centurion heard Paul say that he was a Roman, he went and told the commander, saying, you better watch out what you're fixing to do. Why? Latter part of verse 26. Why? For this man is a Roman. It's against the Roman law to tie ropes around a fellow Roman, to scourge him, beat him, put him in prison, do anything to him, again, without investigation and without a trial. So Paul is holding them accountable. Verse 29, then immediately those who were about to examine him withdrew from him. And the commander was also afraid after he found out that he was a Roman and because he had bound him. So there it is. He was afraid Very serious matter. So Paul held this Roman commander accountable for the way he was being treated. He didn't remain silent. Then Paul is allowed to go to God before the Jewish court. Now, in a moment, I'm going to share with you why we're looking at this and what it has to do with you and what it has to do with me as Christians and what it has to do with American families and with our families. So Paul is allowed to go before the Jewish Sanhedrin court. And notice verse 30 of Acts 22. The next day, because he wanted to know for certain why he was accused by the Jews, he released him from his bonds, the Romans did, and commanded the chief priests and all their council to appear. And they brought Paul down, the Romans did, and set him before them. They didn't just send him away by himself to the Jews. They went with him. Verse 1 of chapter 23 now. Are you with me? Chapter 23, verse 1. Then Paul, looking earnestly at the council, said, Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. And then the judge, the high priest, Ananias. What did Ananias say? He commanded those Romans, those who stood by him, the Roman soldiers, to strike Paul on the mouth. Now notice Paul's response. Then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. For you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck contrary to the law? Paul said, God will strike you, because as a judge you are behaving illegally. But then notice what the Jewish brethren said. Those who stood by said, Paul, do you know that you have reviled God's high priest? Verse 5, Paul said, listen, brethren, I did not know. I did not know that he was a high priest. It's written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. We've always got to manifest dignity and respect and honor of the office. Always. And when he called him a whitewashed wall, he was just sitting there saying, you're trying to cover up your dirty work by telling a Roman to slap me in the mouth. You know, like you cover up a dirty wall with whitewash. At a hearing supposedly aimed at upholding justice, Paul was Ananias was telling others to inflict unjust bodily harm on Paul, who hadn't been found guilty. So Paul apologizes because he admits that he was wrong to speak evil of the ruler. Do you know what he didn't apologize for? He did not apologize or retract his charge that the ruler behaved illegally and will be judged for it. We sometimes miss that, don't we? Paul did not retract that. When he said that to Ananias, a ruler, a judge, that because you have acted illegally, God will judge you. For you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck contrary to the law? Acts 23 and verse 3. So Paul didn't apologize for that. The only thing he apologized for was the way he addressed it. What do we learn from this? Brethren, the church is responsible for holding civil government responsible for their actions and for their failure to carry out the rule of law and to not break it themselves. So Paul spoke out. He didn't remain silent. He was holding this ruler accountable for not carrying out his duty according to the law. He held them accountable. Well, you know, we read back in Psalms 2 where the psalmist said, Be wise, O kings, be instructed, you judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, rejoice with trembling, kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way. God holds judges responsible and so must we. So we have the responsibility not only to pray for our rulers and civil government, but we are to hold them accountable for carrying out their duties effectively and lawfully. We not only have the privilege of prayer in this matter, but the opportunity to hire those who will do their job and fire those who do not. Now this needs to be said up front. The only thing powerful enough to change our culture, and Danny said this many times, and it's true, the only thing powerful enough to change our culture is a return to the God of the Hebrew Scriptures. And that can only be done through the witness of the church. Bringing worthwhile change can only be done through one changed life at a time, one changed family at a time, and one changed community at a time. But that does not mean that we have no responsibility to make wise decisions concerning the government under which we live. One of the biggest problems is silence among the majority. Dr. Phil McGraw has a new book entitled We've Got Issues. The subtitle of the book is How You Can Stand Strong for America's Soul and Sanity. You and I are living in a nation that's gone insane, Brendan. And our nation stands on the edge of a cliff. It's not the old days. It's not like it used to be. We are in perilous times. And we better be making some wise decisions. In this book, Dr. Phil expresses a concern that I've had for many years. That concern is the fact that there's too much apathy and too much complacency among the majority of Americans concerning the decaying toxic culture in which we are now living. Chapter 1 of his book points out that our core values have been toxically disrupted. That's true. And he claims that they've been disrupted by ideologists and activists who disregard the core values of morals, family life, education, hard work, freedom of speech, mental health, objective reality, human nature, and common sense reasoning. We've gone insane. And it's because of the outer fringe. It's not the majority. It's the outer fringe that's directing the narrative. And you know why they're directing the narrative? Because people have remained silent. That's why. They're well-funded, well-organized, and very loud. These ideologists are being able to control the narrative of our culture. And again, the reason is because of silence from the larger group. How many of you ever listened to Dr. Phil McGraw? You know, for 21 years, he's had a platform of helping people. He's got degrees this long in psychology and therapy and all the rest. I can't begin to name it. Before that, I would say, is a professional in litigation and trials and what goes on inside the court. He got his start by helping Oprah Winfrey, if you remember, when she had a court case. And she helped him get into doing the television shows. Well, now Dr. Phil has his own platform, his own studio, and it's under the umbrella of TBN. It's called Mary Street Media, and he's got prime time. If you have the opportunity to listen to this man, I'm sure you have. But he's beginning to deal with other issues. In fact, he interviewed former President Donald Trump just about a week ago. He's going to interview Joe Biden, and he's going to interview Robert Kennedy. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. But here's what Dr. Phil has to say. He claims that apathy, fears, inaction, and wrong thinking has actually enabled, empowered, and invited this toxic disruption in our culture to occur. And he's talking about our culture. He's not just talking about our government. But our government is a part of the culture, isn't it? And it has a lot of control over it. So our culture is toxic and disrupted right now. And Dr. Phil claims it's basically because of people who have been silent because of apathy and fears and wrong thinking. And that silence has actually enabled, empowered, and invited this toxic disruption in our culture. He admits that one or a few persons will never change it. But he says we as a majority can change it. We are in the midst of a Marxist revolution. We're in the midst of a revolution. That's why I said we are on the edge of the cliff of socialism, communism. That is not a conspiracy theory. And in a moment I will share with you why we know it's not. Phil admits that one or a few persons will never change it, but we can if we work together. I want to talk about two forces that should concern all Christians. And the reason it should concern all Christians is because both of these forces are bringing harm to traditional family life. That's our subject, traditional family life. Two forces. Number one, the force of socialism. And what I'm about to say, again, is not a conspiracy theory. This is without doubt the most serious and dangerous attack on traditional family life in our nation and in our time. And much of what I'm stating about socialism, I learned some of it from Dr. Ben Carson in his recent book entitled The Perilous Fight. That's the title of his book. You may have seen it advertised. It's available on Amazon, and I would encourage everyone to read that. The subtitle of his book on the perilous fight is Overcoming Our Culture's War on the American Family. On the American family. In order to establish a communistic rule, there has to be a tearing down of our present form of government. That can only be done by destroying traditional family life. Can't do it without destroying traditional family life. To tear down a nation. Family life is based upon success through hard work and through faith in God. And that enables our families to be strong and relatively independent. And families that function according to God's design have the kind of courage that enables them to stand without being manipulated and without being controlled by governmental forces. And that's why in socialism, a part of their agenda is attacking family life and tearing it down in order to tear the nation down. One of the main goals of a radical communist agenda is to attack and weaken traditional family life by any means possible. And we're seeing it happen in our nation today. It's been going on for a good while. The goal to make America a socialist nation has been in place for decades. And the process of making that a reality is occurring from within our own borders. It destroys ambition, productivity, and success. And so before I read some of the hidden agendas of socialism, before I read it, let me share with you some of the bad effects of socialism. Socialism removes the incentive of hard work due to government handouts. It fosters entitlement and a victim mentality. It robs people of their own dignity and self-respect. Unconditional equality. Unconditional equality, everybody on equal ground, not only fosters entitlement, it fosters envy and criminality. Socialism keeps the populace under the control and power of a tyrannical government. It takes away human rights and freedom of speech. And here's what's important to you and to me. It's a threat to religion and traditional family life, because religion and traditional family life is a threat to their socialistic agenda, which is not the rule of the people, but the rule of those who are in power. Shouldn't what happened during COVID-19 speak loud and clear to us on what government's capable of doing? You remember all of the harassment, the threats, the arrests, even with our churches. You remember that? So, the agenda of the communistic rule. I wish I could put this up on the screen. I'm just going to read it. I'm going to read it slow. Perhaps you've read these. It may be old hat to you. It's not old hat to me. This has opened my eyes. But this goes back to 1958. A former FBI agent by the name of W. Cleon Skousen wrote a book entitled The Naked Communist. The reason he called the book The Naked Communist is because, they try, a socialist, a Marxist, a communist, they try to hide their agenda. They don't put it out there for you to look at, do they? They try to hide it. Well, this FBI agent wrote a book and uncovered it. That's why he called The Naked Communist. He wrote this book to expose their agenda of taking over a nation. He made and I'm not going through all 45 of these agendas, but he made a list of 45 things that are necessary to bring a nation down, so that you can have this revolution and start all over again. I'm only going to list 12 of these goals, which were initiated in the last century and which are actively occurring to this very day. Number 1, promote the UN as the only hope for mankind. If its charter is rewritten, demand that it be set up as a one world government with its own independent forces. Now, we could talk quite a bit about that because it deals with globalism. The UN wants globalism, where everybody again is on equal ground, no superpowers, no super nations. That's why they want to tear down America. Then number 2, capture one or both of the political parties in the United States. Capture one or both of the political parties in the United States. Number 3, use technical decisions of the courts to weaken basic American institutions by claiming their activities violate civil rights, kind of like the ACLU. Number 4, get control of the schools. Get control of the schools. Use them as transmission belts for socialism and current communistic propaganda. Soften the curriculum. Get control of teachers. The associations. Put the party line in textbooks. Number 5, infiltrate the press. Get control of book review assignments, editorial writing, policy making positions. Number 6, gain control of key positions in radio, TV, and motion pictures. 7, continue discrediting American culture by degrading all forms of artistic expression. An American communist cell was told to eliminate all good sculpture from parks and buildings. We know anything about that, tearing down sculptures? And substitute them with shapeless, awkward, and meaningless forms. Number 8, break down cultural standards of morality by promoting pornography and obscenity in books, magazines, motion pictures, radio, and TV. Number 9, infiltrate the churches and replace and reveal religion with a social religion, discredit the Bible, and emphasize the need for intellectual maturity, which does not need a religious crutch. Number 10, eliminate prayer or any phase of religious expression in the schools on the ground that it violates the principle of separation of church and state. That didn't happen until 1963. That's not in the Constitution. Separation between church and state is not in the Bill of Rights. It's not in the Constitution of the United States. It wasn't instituted until by the Supreme Court in 1963. Number 11, discredit the family as an institution. Discredit the family as an institution. Encourage promiscuity and easy divorce. Number 12, emphasize the need to raise children away from the negative influence of their parents. Do we know anything about that? That's been going on. Attribute prejudices, mental blocks, and retarding of children to a suppressive influence of parents. I'm going to take a breath because the next 3 things that I want to share with you is the way they attack the Christian family, the way they attack the traditional family. First of all, they do it through our educational system. Dr. Carson claims that there are many teachers, professors, who indoctrinate their students with radical ideologies, including socialism, racial hatred, gender confusion, and straight-up monogamy. Marxism is rampant in our United States colleges. For the past 30 years, Marxism has been pushed in our higher schools of learning. The students of those professors have infiltrated every part of our society. Keep that in mind. For 30 years, this has been going on. In our schools, well, I guess what we call our schools of elitists, our Ivy League schools especially. But now the students that have graduated from those schools, where are they? Well, they just infiltrated our entire culture. And one of the reasons we've witnessed so many violent protests, I believe, on our college, universities, and campuses concerning a war with Israel, in Israel, is largely due to Marxism. Jewish families in Israel are a threat to Marxism and globalism, just as the way American families are a threat. You'll have to admit, I believe, that much of the damage has already been done in the area of religious faith. For the first time in our nation, for the first time in decades, the number of Americans who claim church affiliation has dropped and fallen below 50%. Below 50%. They attack family life through mainstream media and the entertainment world. Shows like The Waltons, The Andy Griffith Show, Little House on the Prairie will never be the essence of a modern TV production today. Our present shows, in most cases, depict a blended family, with homosexuality and transgenderism as being a normal way of life. Fathers are portrayed as idiots. We're all aware of the fact that mainstream media provokes racial hatred, division, and immoral lifestyles among American families. Pornography, sexual perversion, and obscenity of every sort is available 24/7 for anyone who wishes to participate. It's estimated that over 70% of teenagers watch pornography online. Over 70%. It's not difficult to see that socialists use mainstream media to undermine the importance of faith, family, parental guidance, and hard work and morality. All of that is intentional. It's intentional by those who wish to destroy our families and destroy our nation. They are attacking family life through a political party. Remember one of the rules and one of the agendas in that book called The Naked Communist? Capture one or both of the political parties in the United States. On page 81 of Dr. Carson's book, he points out, as noted in The Naked Communist, that the long march of socialism has also targeted one of our political parties with much success. In 2000, and I'm not going to name the party, you can go and look on, just put it up online, look on your Gallup poll and other sources, and you will see and read what I'm going to read. But I'm not going to mention the party. In 2010, according to a Gallup poll, about 55% of this particular party had a positive view of socialism. In 2021, that number had risen to 65%. 65% of this party felt positive about socialism over that of capitalism. Again, think about the agenda of the socialists. Remember, Karl Marx called for the abolition of the family. The abolishing of family life, discrediting parental authority. That's going on in many of our schools. We know that to be true. Now, I need to state at this point that this alone is not a biblical enough reason for Christian people to be involved in holding our government accountable. Socialism can cause free people to lose their freedom, can it? 80 years ago, on June the 6th, D-Day, 1944, boys left their homes and fought as men. Just this past week, we saw photos of young men in boats heading for Normandy. They're just boys. I can't imagine, can you, what was going through the minds of these young men as they stepped out on the beachhead of Normandy, not knowing for sure if they were going to be able to come home. And when I look into the faces of these young men, I weep. I weep. Because we lost 2,501 of these brave soldiers on that momentous day. They died for our freedom. And to think that we would sit back and say nothing and do nothing to keep from losing that freedom to socialism is the height of shame and disgrace. I'm exercising freedom of speech. You don't have to agree with me. You don't have to share what I believe. But I'm exercising my freedom of speech. The force in this business about separation of church and state, we have carried that to an extreme, really. The force of crime. Talk about the force of socialism. Let's talk about the force of crime. Violent crimes, of course, include rape and murder and armed robbery. We know that it's out of control in our nation. When you hear national and state officials state that crime has decreased recently, have you heard that lately? That's gone down? We're not to believe that. And the reason is because a large percentage of the crimes committed are not even reported. You go to the city of New York, they turn them loose. They're not reported. And so that's propaganda. And you can only believe half, if any, a lot of what you hear on our mainstream media sources. And that's why I appreciate Dr. Phil McGraw so much and his platform. I trust the man. I trust Bill O'Reilly. And I believe it when he says this is the no-spin news. So when you hear national and state officials state that crime has decreased, I don't believe they're telling the truth. Criminals, especially in our large cities, are being turned loose, and therefore the crime is never reported. It's rampant, and civil government is failing to take the proper action to curtail it. Our government has always had a degree of corruption due to the thirst of power, but nothing like we are now experiencing. I know that God isn't tied to a battle. Do you understand I'm reading from my book? I hope that's okay. I know that God isn't tied to a ballot box when it comes to putting in power whom He chooses. Whatever God allows and does is His sovereign business. And nobody rules on the throne anywhere but what God didn't put them there. And He's not tied to a ballot box to do it. And whoever ends up as our next president, God will have put them there. I believe that. I believe that's what the Bible teaches. But that does not change our responsibility, does it? What we're called upon to do as Christians is love God and love our neighbor. Love God and love your neighbor. Under our present circumstances, I don't feel that we can love our neighbor and our families without being concerned about what is happening to them due to our high crime rate and the push of socialism in our nation. We must show love for our neighbor. And I believe that holds civil government responsible for protecting our neighbor. That takes us back to why I started the lesson the way I did. That's their job. And Christians should feel a great responsibility as God's agents to make a difference in our community, our state, our nation, and our world. And again, we do that by speaking out against evil works and holding government responsible for protecting American families. Think about the high crime rate in many of our major cities. Think about what's happening to our crime rate due to the soft crime policies, soft on crime policies promoted by our governing authorities. Think about all the rape, the plunder, the burning, the atrocities, and the death that's been propagated by our open border policy. Think about that. Does any responsibility fall on us as Christian taxpayers to see that changes are made, while at the same time wanting God's will to be done? Romans 13:8, he who loves another has fulfilled the law. You shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. If there's any other commandment, it's summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Love is the fulfillment of the Lord. Somebody says, I don't do any harm to my neighbor. But are you trying to curtail those who are doing harm to your neighbor? I believe that that's involved. Turning the other cheek doesn't mean that you don't protect your family and your neighbor. If I see someone or some cultural force that's doing you harm, I'll do everything that's possible to protect you. That's loving my neighbor. So when we go to the polls this November, let us not vote out of habit. Let us vote out of love for our families and out of love for all American families. And let us vote out of being well informed. And let's start from the ground up. Let's start with the dog catcher. Because if a lot of people are being bitten by dogs all over the community, we need to throw the dog catcher to the curb and replace him with someone that will do their job. And if some judge sitting on a bench is turning the criminals loose, we need to do everything within our power to see that judge is removed. And on up you go. That didn't come from me. I stole that from Phil McGraw. So for the sake of all American families, we must not withdraw from civil government. We dare not privatize our faith, but apply it to all aspects of life, including our responsibility to governing authorities. We have the right and the duty to do that. and I believe a responsibility. We are living at a time when a mass of innocent people, many of them young people, are being captured and raped and sold and slaughtered by bad people, both indigenous criminals and those coming across our southern and northern border. Did you know that there are 85,000 unaccompanied children that have crossed our border that are missing? 85,000 children are missing. And our government cannot give an account for their welfare or their whereabouts. Many of them have been sold into sweatshops and prostitution rings. Should that concern you and I as Christians? Should it?
Absolutely.
I'm not opposed to immigration. We need immigration. We need the right kind of immigration. Because in the United States, our birth rate, it keeps going down and down. That cannot continue without our nation collapsing. We can't all grow old and not have younger people to keep our economy going. And our birth rate is dropping for many reasons. So we welcome immigration, but we want it to be legal and vetted so that terrorists and criminals are not coming in and walking on our streets. I believe the number when they state that at least 11 million have crossed the border. And I also believe the research that Bill O'Reilly has done with his staff. He's got a large staff. I believe the research, when they've concluded that at least 10% of that 11 million are criminals. That means that we've got at least 1 million walking on the streets that have crossed our border. It's an invasion. Should we not be concerned about that and want to do something about it? I heard the governor of the state of Virginia state that they lose 5 people a day to fentanyl. The drug traffic alone, especially that of fentanyl, is enough reason to be gravely concerned about the safety of American families and the border crisis. We know that God's in control, as we said. Sets up kings, removes them. But again, that doesn't remove our responsibility. And hence, I believe we need to consider the need to hire civil leaders who seek to protect the ones we love the most, our families. The so-called separation between church and state shouldn't keep us from talking about this. We need to talk about it. We need to be able to do it at disagree and stay at peace. Again, separation between church and state is not even part of the Constitution. That's something we need to look at. And we need to know whether or not a governing authority will occasion criminal activity or be opposed to it. And I believe that we need to ask questions. Are the candidates under consideration against a wide open border that allows an invasion of foreigners into our country? Are the candidates pro-life? Are they against the genital mutilation of young boys? Do their policies align with Sodom and Gomorrah? Are they against brainwashing our children with immoral and harmful ideologies in our schools? Are they against communism and Marxism and socialism, which takes away religious freedom? Are they opposed to a judicial system that believes the criminal is the victim and fails therefore to apply the consequences of the law in order to protect innocent people? These questions, as well as others, are important when it comes to selecting our national leaders. I realize you cannot place all the blame on national leaders, but they are, again, part of our culture and part of the problem. Dr. Phil McGraw says we need to push back. Did Jesus push back when he cleansed the temple? The poor were being abused by a religious system that had gone political. He wasn't going to tolerate it. Did Paul push back? Did he withstand against the magistrates? Civil government has a great responsibility. Do you have any thoughts you want to share before I'm going to close this with, am I supposed to have already stopped?
10 minutes ago.
Oh, been done 10 minutes ago.
Well, why didn't you say something? All right. Or am I supposed to give an invitation? Okay.
You know, Don, what you're saying is so very important to this world and our children and our grandchildren, that they don't hear these things that you're saying tonight. There's very few people saying them, and if people are saying them, the government and different ones are saying that these people are racial, or they're trying to say they don't know what they're talking about. But, of course, I've been around a while. I've seen a lot of change in this world, a lot of changes that's not good. And, of course, I worry about my grandchildren, I worry about children. But you're so right on with what's happening. And it's good to see somebody stand up and say something. Because you can't find people that will stand up and say something. They think that way, but they won't open their mouth. They don't be.
Well, we just need to look at the facts.
That's right.
I went to a specialist recently to have a pulmonary test, and we got to talking about this, and he said, my parents, year after year after year, when they go to the polls, they don't consider the issues. It's all party. And we ought to be able to look at the evidence and the issues without having a falling out with one another. And I believe we can do that. I believe we're mature enough as Christians. I believe we love each other enough. We can be kind enough and treat each other with dignity and respect. And even if we disagree, we can still try to understand each other. That's one of the things that sometimes people don't do. We don't try to understand each other, where we're coming from, and listen to one another. You know, I believe the greatest of all commissions is when Jesus said, "Follow thou me." That's the greatest commission. When he said, "Whosoever will come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me." And if you need to have prayers tonight in regard to anything, we're here to pray with you.